In January 2021, Saudi Arabia announced plans for a city unlike anything the world had ever seen. It would have no streets, no cars, and supposedly no emissions. The entire city would be built inside one continuous structure stretching 170 kilometers across the desert, standing taller than the Empire State Building, and covered in mirrors from one end to the other. And somehow, 9 million people were supposed to live inside it. So I wanted to figure out what actually happened between that announcement and today. And to answer that, we have to look at falling oil prices, pressure inside the Saudi government, and a leaked audit with a price tag so massive it changed everything. And some of the biggest engineering problems ever connected to a single project. And don't worry, by the end of this video, we'll get to the question everyone has been asking. Is the line actually over? But first, we need to go back to what was originally promised, because that promise is what makes this entire story so unbelievable. So if you're not familiar, the line is part of Neom, a massive development zone in northwestern Saudi Arabia, right along the Red Sea. The area is roughly the size of Belgium, and Saudi Arabia set it aside to build what was supposed to become an entirely new economy from the ground up. At the center of all this was the line. The plan called for two parallel walls of buildings, each 500 meters tall and only 200 meters apart, stretching 170 kilometers from the Gulf of Aqaba deep into the desert. And the entire outside would be covered in mirrors. So from a distance, one of the largest structures ever imagined would reflect the desert around it and almost disappear. So what would actually be inside of it? Well, everything you need. Work, school, groceries, parks, and all of this within a 5-minute walk. And if you needed to travel farther, a high-speed train would supposedly take you from one end of the city to the other in just 20 minutes. But over 170 kilometers, that would require average speeds of more than 500 kilometers per hour, faster than any train currently operating in commercial service. The entire city was also supposed to run on renewable energy, with 1.5 million people living there by 2030, eventually growing to 9 million. The renderings looked incredible, but they were still just renderings. So to actually understand why Saudi Arabia would even attempt something this extreme, we really have to understand what the country is trying to move away from. For decades, oil has funded most of the Saudi government, but Saudi leaders know that relying on oil forever is not a long-term plan. This is where Vision 2030 comes in, led by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The goal is to build a much more diverse economy through tourism, technology, foreign investment, and industries that have nothing to do with oil. Neom was supposed to be the centerpiece of that plan, and the line was supposed to be the centerpiece of Neom. It was basically Saudi Arabia's way of showing the world that its future would look completely different from its past. But that also meant the line was never just another construction project. From the very beginning, its success was tied directly to the reputation of the most powerful man in the country. And for a while, it really looked like the line was starting to happen. Throughout late 2022 and into 2023, footage from the site showed a massive construction operation. Hundreds of excavators and thousands of trucks were cutting a trench through the desert. Worker camps were built for tens of thousands of laborers, and Neom claimed it was carrying out the largest pilling operation in the world, driving thousands of foundation columns into the ground near the coast. Quick pause, if you guys like videos about huge mega projects like this, remember to hit that subscribe button because it really helps the channel and I really appreciate it. So let's say you measure progress by how much dirt was being moved, well then the line looked very real. But moving dirt is also the easy part of a project like this. A trench is not a foundation is not a building, and even a building is not a city that 9 million people have actually agreed to move into. And of course, that difference matters because it explains almost everything that happens next. In April 2024, Bloomberg reported that expectations inside the project had dropped dramatically. Instead of 1.5 million people living in the line by 2030, the new target was reportedly fewer than 300,000. And instead of completing a major section of the city, only about 2.4 kilometers of the original 170 were expected to be finished. So the line went from a line to a dot, relatively. And that dot is just 1.4% of the original length. And that same report said Neom's annual budget had still not been approved by Saudi Arabia's Sovereign Wealth Fund, and at least one contractor had already started cutting workers. But publicly, Saudi officials denied that the project was being scaled back. The country's economy minister told CNBC that everything was still moving full steam ahead. Then, the leadership changed. In November 2024, Neom's longtime CEO, Nazmi Al-Nasser, suddenly stepped down after running the project since 2018. His replacement, Ayman Al-Mudaffar, came directly from the real estate division of Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, and one of the first things he did was order a full strategic review of Neom's major projects, which is usually not a great sign when you are already this far into construction. Then, the results of that review started leaking. In 2025, the Wall Street Journal reported that an internal audit presented to Neom's board estimated the full vision could cost as much as $8.8 trillion. That was far beyond the roughly $500 billion originally associated with Neom as a whole. And according to the audit, the full project might not be finished until around 2080. If you compare that cost with the original plan for 9 million residents, it works out to nearly $1 million in construction costs for every person living there. And to put $8.8 trillion into perspective, that is more than 4 times the size of Saudi Arabia's entire economy. So yes, numbers like that can completely change a project. Throughout 2025, the line's workforce reportedly started shrinking, while outside consultants were brought in to figure out whether the project was even realistic anymore. Then, in September, reports said Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund had suspended construction on the line altogether. And by 2026, the direction seemed much clearer. The project was reportedly pushed back until sometime after 2030, while Neom began shifting its focus towards a smaller, more industrial future. So, how did a project backed by one of the richest governments in the world fall apart so quickly? And from my research, which the sources are in the description, it really comes down to 3 different things: money, physics, and people. The money problem is actually pretty simple. Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund is not only paying for Neom, it's also funding Qiddiya, Diriyah development, Red Sea resorts, a new national airline, and preparations for the 2034 World Cup. And most of that spending still depends heavily on oil revenue. Some analysts estimate Saudi Arabia needs oil prices above $90 a barrel to balance its budget. But for much of the past 2 years, prices were closer to $70 a barrel. At the same time, the foreign investors Saudi Arabia hoped would help fund these projects mostly stayed on the sidelines. So when the amount of money is limited, but the number of massive projects keeps growing, eventually something has to be cut back. And the line, being the most expensive project of them all, appears to have been one of the first to take the hit. Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund has since taken a multi-billion-dollar write-down on several of its giga-projects. And the physics problem is even more interesting to me, because it was built into the shape of the city itself. A straight line is actually one of the worst possible layouts for a city. Obviously, right? Okay, so let's think about it. Most cities spread outward in a rough circle because that keeps people, roads, utilities, and services closer together. But if you stretch 9 million people across 170 kilometers, the average distance between 2 random residents could be around 55 kilometers, and that creates a huge problem. Everything the city depends on, transportation, electricity, water, and emergency services, would have to run through one extremely long and vulnerable system. If the entire population depends on one main rail line, a single breakdown could disrupt the whole city. And the promise of traveling from one end to the other in 20 minutes also does not really work with the idea of a 5-minute city, because if the train stops often enough to serve everyone, it cannot also travel the full 170 kilometers that quickly. Okay, then you have to cool a 200-meter wide mirrored canyon in a desert where temperatures regularly climb above 45 degrees Celsius. At that point, the design starts to feel less like a practical city plan and more like an incredible rendering that nobody stopped to question. But that's not all. Then we have the people problem, which the entire business model depends on millions of people choosing to live inside a mirrored canyon in the Tabuk Desert instead of somewhere like Dubai. And the thing is, there was never really proof that this kind of demand exists, not at this scale and not at any price. But there's also a much darker side to the story. The land the line was planned to cross was not empty. Members of the Huwaitat tribe had lived in villages along the route for generations, and evictions began in 2020. One resident, Abdul Rahim al-Huwaiti, posted videos online refusing to leave his home. He lost his life to Saudi security forces in April of 2020. Saudi authorities said he opened fire first, but his family and human rights groups disputed that account. Then, in October of 2022, a Saudi court sentenced 3 members of the tribe, including his brother, to lose their lives for resisting the displacement. Others received prison sentences of up to 50 years. A separate British documentary, released in 2024, also alleged that thousands of migrant workers had lost their lives across Saudi Arabia's giga-projects since Vision 2030 began. Saudi Arabia disputed those claims, and the reporting did not establish that all of those people lost their lives while working directly on Neom. But it's pointing to a larger problem that often appears when mega projects are placed under enormous political pressure. When finishing on time becomes more important than everything else, the people with the least power are often the ones who pay the highest price. So that brings us to one of the biggest questions. What actually exists today? And the easiest way to understand it is to split everything into 3 categories. First, what was announced, 170 kilometers of mirrored city built for 9 million people. Second, what was under construction before the reported suspension, which was a few kilometers of excavation, foundation pilling, and early concrete work near the Gulf of Aqaba around the planned marina section. And third, what has actually been completed? For the line itself, the answer is basically nothing. There are no occupied floors, no operating transit system, and no mirrored exterior installed at anything close to the promised scale. The most complete part of the wider Neom project is actually a luxury island resort that opened in 2024, and reports suggest it has remained largely unused since. So, is the line actually canceled? Officially, no one has ever used that word, and they probably never will. What seems to be happening is something much quieter and much more common with mega projects like this. The project keeps getting smaller, while the original renderings stay exactly the same. It is basically cancellation through revision. And based on the current reporting, the most likely future is a version of Neom built around its port, industrial zone, and projects that are much easier to finance. Meanwhile, the excavation for the line could remain in place as an option for the future, or as the most expensive trench ever dug. A city designed to look incredible in renderings may eventually be replaced by infrastructure designed to actually make money. And this shift towards infrastructure deserves a closer look, because it shows where the money may be going next. In January 2026, the Financial Times reported that the line was being redesigned into something much smaller and more industrial, with AI data centers potentially becoming a major part of the new plan. As one person involved with the project reportedly explained, data centers need huge amounts of water for cooling, and this site is right along the coast. Neom has also started promoting the area's renewable energy potential, open land, and existing digital infrastructure as major advantages for AI companies. And the investment is already starting to move in that direction. Neom signed a $5 billion deal with DataVolt to build an AI computing campus at Oxagon, its industrial zone along the Red Sea. The first phase is expected around 2028, and the facility plans to use seawater for cooling instead of relying on the region's limited fresh water supply. Saudi Arabia's state-backed AI company has also announced plans for enormous amounts of computing capacity. And there's almost something ironic about that shift, because after spending 5 years asking whether millions of people would ever choose to live inside the line, Saudi Arabia may have finally found the perfect tenant. Something that needs huge amounts of land, electricity, and water, but almost no people at all. And that is already a clear example of how something like this can play out. For example, Masdar City in Abu Dhabi was announced in 2006 as the world's first zero-carbon city designed for 50,000 people. But nearly 2 decades later, only a small part of the original vision has actually been built. The goals have changed several times. The project has become much smaller, and yet it has never officially been canceled. It just keeps shrinking every time someone checks on it, and the line now appears to be heading down a very similar path, just on a much larger scale. Because mega projects like this usually don't get canceled publicly. They shrink behind the scenes, one revision at a time, until eventually the original announcement is almost all that is left. And this story is still not over. The trench is still there, The renderings are still online, and Saudi Arabia still says the vision has not changed. But that claim becomes harder to believe every year the mirrors fail to appear. Subscribe if you want more videos about how the built world actually works. I'm Tristan, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.